Here's a piece of furniture that's super comfortable but no longer my style. I've had it for over a decade, but it needed a bit of an upgrade that didn't break the bank. For this project, I started by washing and bleaching two 6-foot by 9-foot drop cloths to lighten and soften them. First, I started on the back of the chair. I draped one of the drop cloths over the back, then at the seam I made a snip, then ripped it in half to remove the excess fabric. I made sure the fabric was centered, then at the top I made sure there was at least a 1/2 inch of extra fabric for the seam allowance. Then on the sides I began folding and pinning the fabric so it was nicely fitted to my chair. For the bottom of the back, I pulled the fabric taut and pinned it to the chair, then cut away the excess so it met the floor. Then I went back to the sides and used some tailor's chalk to mark the contours of the back of the chair, then cut away any excess, leaving about 1 inch for seam allowance. For the arms of the chair, first I draped a piece of cloth over the arm, tucked it into the chair, then started pinning the fabric to the chair to make it nice and fitted. Then I used my tailor's chalk again to mark the outline of the arm onto the fabric, then cut away the excess. Next, I took another piece of fabric and pinned it onto the side of the chair and pinned it to the back piece and the arm. Then I cut away the excess fabric so the fabric was at floor level, and I left enough fabric at the seams, which was about 1 inch. Then I pinned the seam together in the front. For the back cushion, I draped another piece of fabric over the back, tucked it in, cut off the excess, leaving enough room on the bottom to tuck it in, then began folding and pinning the piece so it fit nicely and snug. I pinned the top to the back piece, the side pieces, and the arm cushions. Once all the pieces except the seat portion were pinned in place, I sewed the seams together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but left all the corners open. Then I placed the cover back on, trimmed the excess fabric on the seams, and pinned the corners properly and sewed them in place. Next, I used my serger to serge all the edges that were going to be tucked into the chair. For the seat of the chair, I flipped up the footrest, then draped a piece of fabric over top, then tucked in the sides and used my tailor's chalk to mark where I needed to cut. Then I cut out that piece, leaving several inches around the perimeter for tucking. For the curved portion, I folded it up 1/2 inch and sewed as close to the edge as I could, leaving an opening on both sides of the curve. Then I used a bodkin and inserted a 1/4 inch elastic into one end and fed it to the other. I made sure it was stretchy enough to fit over the bottom of the footrest, then snipped the elastic. For the last part of this project, I measured along the entire bottom of the chair, which came to 107 inches, then I cut and ripped 3 pieces of drop cloth at 4.5 inches wide. I sewed the short ends of the drop cloth together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then folded one long side down a 1/4 inch, then another 1/4 inch, pinned and hemmed it. On the other long side, I folded and pressed it down 1/2 inch. Starting in the front of the chair and leaving just a little bit extra, I began pinning the strip of fabric to the bottom of the cover. Every 4 to 5 inches, I created a little pleat and pinned it in place to create a soft ruffle look. Once the pinning was done, I top stitched the ruffle onto the cover. I also made a hole for the lifter on the side and added elastic ribbons to the front of the cover to keep it on snug. Now I have a slipcover that matches my decor better, and it was super inexpensive to make. I hope this simple skirted chair slipcover tutorial inspired you to make one too. The thrift store is full of solid pieces of vintage and antique furniture just waiting for a new life. And the secret ingredient to transforming and upcycling some of these pieces is fabric softener. For this project, I took a trip to my favorite thrift store and spotted this vintage solid wood chair for $25 that had beautiful carvings and was super comfortable to sit in. To start, I began sanding the wood portion of the chair with 80 grit sandpaper and an orbital sander to remove the bulk of the stain from the arms, legs, and back of the chair. Because this chair had lots of grooves and small spaces where the orbital sander couldn't reach, I sanded the rest of the stain off by hand with 80 grit sandpaper, then went into all the nooks and crannies with my Dremel. To remove the remainder of the stain, I sprayed the wood with oven cleaner, allowed it to sit for about 30 minutes, then used a stiff brush to scrub it down. Once I was done scrubbing, I washed all the oven cleaner off and allowed it to dry overnight. The next day, I did a final sanding with 220 grit sandpaper, then used a brush to remove all the dust from the crevices and vacuumed the entire chair. Next, I painted on some wood conditioner to the wood, allowed that to dry for about 30 minutes, then stained it first in the color Early American, then I went in with a gel stain in the color Hickory. Once again, I allowed the wood to dry overnight. Once the stain was completely dry, I used my upholstery cleaner to deep clean all the fabric, then I taped off the wood around the upholstered sections. To transform the upholstery, I first mixed a base coat of fabric paint, which was 1 part latex paint to 2 parts fabric softener. I started off with about 4 ounces of paint and 8 ounces of fabric softener and mixed it all together. Before painting the upholstery, I used a water bottle to spray the fabric and used my hand to ensure that there was even distribution of the water. Then I applied a light layer of paint to all of the upholstery, allowed it to dry for a few hours, then went in for a second layer of the base coat. Once the first 2 coats of paint were dry, I used a 400 grit sanding block to lightly sand the paint, then wiped away the dust. Next, I mixed up a batch of the final color paint, again using 4 ounces of paint and 8 ounces of fabric softener, then sprayed the fabric with water and applied the next coat. I allowed the paint to dry for a few hours, then applied 3 additional coats in the same way for a total of 6 coats. I found that it was important for the fabric to be wet before applying the next coat of paint, but I only found the need to sand twice throughout the whole process. Once the paint was dry, I added a layer of feed-in wax to the wood portions of the chair instead of sealing it with a top coat because I liked the look of the raw wood best. Now the chair is complete. I'm so happy with how it turned out. It went from a dated chair to a more stately piece of furniture that fits my style so much better, and what really made the biggest impact was painting the fabric.
I found these beautiful chairs on the curb for free and loaded them into my car for my next project. First, I removed the seat cushions and gave them both a good clean. Then using a sanding block, I lightly sanded all the surfaces just enough to remove the glossy finish. Next, I placed the chairs side by side with a 12-inch gap. I cut a couple of 2x4s, made pocket holes on either ends, and connected the 2 chairs together. Then I measured the total length of the seating area and cut 3/4 inch thick pine boards to size. I needed 3 1x6 boards for this seat. I rounded the edges and sanded it smooth with 120 grit sandpaper. After wiping off the dust, I stained the wood with an outdoor grade stain in walnut shade. Next, I sprayed an even coat of white primer on the chairs. Once the primer dried, I applied multiple coats of this light beige paint that's good for both indoor and outdoor use. Once it was dry, I placed the wood seat on top and secured it by adding screws from underneath. And there you have it, a modern bench made from old chairs. Perfect to add a little charm to your front porch, cozy up your deck, or create a hangout spot in your yard.